No, not only listening to, but honoring Dr. Asanda Benya from the University of Cape Town, and who is presently our ACLS Fellow. ACLS stands for American Council of Learned Societies, and every year they send here at work at least 2 fellows as part of their program entitled African Humanities Program. So we've been receiving these fellows for some time now, going over 5 years or even 10 years. But really I should say that these fellows are given the scholarship to come to work to Dakar, to Senegal, for a period of time and engage in their writing projects. Very often we have had fellows coming in here and in the middle of their stay for one reason or another maybe have to go back home, or maybe be in Dakar but almost remain invisible for work. They are not absolutely obliged to stay here or come. They are invited to come and enjoy the place and enjoy maybe the congeniality of a place so that to be able to write in peace. But many, the moment they come, become almost invisible. And actually, I made the representation to the people in charge of ACLS in the United States, I think in Washington, D.C. or in New York. But if I was given to rate Asanda, I don't think I would have any grounds for complaint in terms of her dedication to the reason why she was sent here, but in terms of also the very friendly connection she very quickly worked out with the entire staff. So Asanda, thank you for that dedication, that openness, and that friendship. That being said, of course ACLS fellows are not, it is not a mandate for them to make a presentation at work, but in as much as they can accommodate, we certainly welcome them to make a presentation. And Asanda was just requested by, I think, myself to make a presentation if she could, and she immediately said that she would just make this presentation today in connection with her research and her academic interest. So going underground in South African platinum mines to explore women's miners' experiences is the topic she is about to make a presentation on. You will know that she did not say to explore miners' experiences, she said women miners' experiences. And today she was about to tell me about her feminist slant. I told her that I am gay. I am willing to be the victim of all women in the world. They can do whatever they want. I am not going to complain, and I have no cause to defend. They can exploit me, harass me, and everything. I'm not going to retaliate. But she said, I think she said she was a, an open-minded feminist. She did not say accommodating, but open-minded feminist. So if I'm wrong, you could just correct me. But talking about mining, mining is central not only to the South African experience, but also to the black experience in South Africa. In those days, all these black South Africans coming from the provinces, from the villages in South Africa, and going in the surrounding of Johannesburg, going down under in the mines. And I have a comment to make actually about one particular place here which she mentioned. And Peter Abrahams and all his writing many others, Mind Boy, for some of you who may be familiar with South African literature. If you are not, go back and read. That's a very rich literature. So this is what she's going to talk about. So, and maybe I should very quickly, read her short bio here. Asanda being a sociologist by training, lecturing in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, and being a research associate at the Society Work and Development Institute, SWOP, at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Her work is around black feminist thought, and she focuses on the intersection of gender, class, and race. Gender, class, and race. Her research is an ethnographic study of women underground miners in South Africa's platinum mines. In an attempt to develop a feminist mining scholarship that disrupts the masculine canon in labor and mining studies, she's currently looking at issues of identity construction in underground mining. She has published in areas of women in mining, broadly on gender and the extractive industries, social justice, labor, and trade union. 2 of her articles have won national and international awards. Her article, The Invisible Hands, Women in Marikana, won the Review of African Political Economy Ruth First Award. She is visiting work as an ACLS fellow. I hope when you hear Marikana, you should, crop up your ears, because Marikana, in 2012, became known to the rest of the world for very bad reasons, for horrendous and horrible reasons. Because at Marikana, there was what is called a massacre in the 21st century. She didn't mention this. But the moment I read and saw Marikana, my ears cropped, because I remember what happened, and I wanted more detail to share with you. The massacre took place on the periphery of Wonderkop, near Marikana, South Africa. The Marikana massacre, which took place on 16th of August 2012, was the most lethal use of force by South African security forces against civilians since 1976. Note, 1976, South Africa was not free yet of apartheid. 2012, it is way after Mandela came to power. The shootings have been described as a massacre in the South African media and have been compared to the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. The incident took place on the 25-year anniversary of a nationwide South African miners' strike. The killing took place at 2 locations, roughly 500 meters away from each other, with 17 people fatally wounded at each of these locations. The vast majority of those killed were killed by fire from the R5 assault rifle used by the South African police services. The official figure for strikers injured during the shooting is 78. The strike was considered a seminal event in modern South African history and was followed by similar strikes at other mines across South Africa. Events which collectively made 2012 the most protest-filled year in the country since the end of apartheid. The Marikana massacre started as a wildcat strike at a mine owned by Lomnen in the Marikana area, close to Rustenburg. But that should suffice. I think it gives you an idea of what Madam Professor is particularly interested in. So without further ado, we're going to give a floor to our friend, I would say, Dr. Asanda Benya, commonly known in work as simply Asanda. You got the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor San. And maybe before I begin, I wanted to also extend my gratitude to you for hosting me the past, it's been 2 months now, it's going for a 3rd month, and that's unfortunately my last month, so I just wanted to extend my gratitude for your generosity, for opening up work space to me, and also the resources. But not just you, but everyone at work. I think I have felt the teranga, and it got me. From Marianne, Abdullah, Andy, Mbacho, Seidu, and Wali's staff, Wali himself, Awa, and Mary, and the library staff. I think Adama was here earlier, Adama and Badara, so I'm very grateful to everyone for their hospitality and for being so generous with me and sharing not only their resources, but their networks and supporting me throughout my stay here. It's something I'm grateful for. And as I prepare to leave, I'm very sad because I'll be leaving behind people I consider friends now. I wanted to dedicate my talk today to workers of the world. So I'm not just a feminist, but I'm also a socialist feminist. Something you didn't know.
Amanda.
So, dedicate my talk today to workers of the world. Just a few days ago, we were celebrating Workers' Day, well, progressive countries in the world, except for those that we will not mention. And I was thinking about the privileges we enjoy and the rights we enjoy as people who are working and even people who are not working. Privileges like having the weekend, and I think it's something we often take for granted that we have the weekend free. We forget that actually the weekend, workers' rights, unionization, and all of these things is things that people died for, is things that people demanded, and as we know, power never concedes. You always have to demand. It never has ever conceded. And so when I was thinking about the workers and the demands that they've put before capital for us to enjoy of these things, I thought I'd like to dedicate today's talk to that. So thanking WAC, but also thanking ACLS and also the National Research Foundation back home who have contributed to my stay here. I wanted to talk today, and I guess what I'm talking about today speaks a little bit to the dedication to workers. It's around questions of decent work, decent life. It's around questions of decent wages, but it's also recognizing the role of women within all of that. So I will be talking about not just women who are working underground in mines, but I've been thinking a lot around the question of inclusion. So if we are talking about women in mining, a lot of people think it's an oxymoron. So there's an internal contradiction within that. People often think, not that there is an inherent contradiction. And by that I mean people often, as you were already hinting, that when you think about mines, people think men automatically. When you think about mine workers, the things that, or the people who are often imagined are men. But in today's case, I wanted to focus and talk about women. So this oxymoron that people often think about. But ask questions around inclusion, right? And just as a bit of a background, women in mining in South Africa is fairly new who are working underground in mines, but around the world, women have been working in different parts of mining, and I'll get into those details in a little bit, in a bit of time. I started doing this research in 2008, a few years after the first group of women started working underground in the mines. And I returned again for my doctoral studies in 2011 until 2014, using participant observation to try and understand what exactly is happening with women who are working underground in mines. And I thought I wanted to use participant observation, meaning I went and I lived with the mine workers and I worked with them for about a year. It was really because I thought, well, doing interviews or any other method will not really give me the richness that I think I wanted to get with the study. And hence I decided then to go and live and work with them. But I also knew that if I'm talking to workers only, there are certain things that are verbally inaccessible but observable that I wanted to unpack. I wanted to understand the contradictions that people often think about when they're thinking about women in mining. And I thought using this methodology then would allow me to do that. And perhaps what I must also mention is that while I'll be talking about these questions of inclusion today, this is just one small part of a book that I have been writing, that I've been busy with here at WAC. And I'm happy to chat a little bit about the book later, but I thought because it's a Friday, I must not get into too much details because the book is quite theoretical. And some of the chapters that are in the book, as you can see on the slides, are around bodies, because people often use bodies to legitimize why women should not be in mining. And what I'm doing in the book is to use bodies to carve out space to show why women should in fact be in mining if we are to do mining. I'm not a supporter of mining. I think it's destroying the environment. But if we are to have mining and men are working in the mines, so should women. But maybe let's take a little bit of a step back and look at the historical overview. And I can't give a history of mining fully, but I can give an overview. I started by saying that in South Africa, it's new to have women who are working underground in mines, but I think it's important to also state that mining, the women in mining generally around the world, is not necessarily a new phenomenon. Women from the 1600s have been working in mines, and in some cases working underground in mines. And as you can see there are countries that have had women working underground, above ground, in the rivers, mining, doing mining work. But the prohibition started around the 1800s, around 1842 to be specific. And Britain was the first country to prohibit women from going underground in mines. And I'm mentioning Britain because in South Africa it's a very central country, because they were the ones who colonized South Africa, hence the mentioning of Britain. So banning or prohibiting mining from Britain had a direct impact on mining in South Africa, because when we started mining in the 1860s already, there was this ban in Britain, and so it meant we adopted all of that in South Africa. But obviously there were times where while women were banned or prohibited from working underground in mines around the world wars, so the First World War, the Second World War, around that time they would relax these prohibitions because they needed labor and men were all out working in the wars. And so they would relax the prohibitions and allow women to come and work in the space. But in 1935, the International Labour Organization, I'm sure some of you know what the International Labour Organization does, they again reinforced and were very strict on the prohibition of women who are working underground in mines. In South Africa, the latest prohibition, believe it or not, was in 1991. But in 1991, that's when we were also thinking, Mandela had just been released, as you were saying, but that's when we were also thinking about questions of inclusion. So there was this law introduced that was prohibiting, excluding women, but the country was already thinking about inclusion and so forth. And just to give an example, to explain why the prohibitions, that these prohibitions from women working underground, there was nothing legitimate about them. These were just cultural myths in some cases. And in other cases, it was people who had these Victorian ideas about women, about women's place, that women should be in the home and not at work. So there was nothing essential about them, but it was people's stereotypical understandings about women and women's bodies. And in the case of South Africa, like I said, the colonial history of Britain, but also the apartheid legislations that reinforced the exclusion of women in South Africa. But you have 1994 coming, and you had a lot of people talking about, well, if we are transforming in South Africa, and if we are moving from apartheid to post-apartheid, what does that mean for questions of inclusion of women in places like the mines? If we're talking about inclusion, we cannot talk about it in, only in racial terms, because apartheid was not just a system that was race-based, but also there were certain direct effects that it had on women, particularly for being women and black women in particular. And so you had people talking then about inclusion and really saying we need to be thinking about industries that have also for a long time excluded women, and mining was one of those industries. So you have the mining industry then saying, well, if we are wanting then to be inclusive, we need to repeal and replace some of the mining laws or policies with much more progressive policies. So after 1994, you had the Mine Health and Safety Act in South Africa being instituted. you had things like the constitution that was enshrining equality, that was enshrining inclusion. So it was not just a matter of we need to change these policies, but it was actually a constitutional matter, that it was about making sure that we recognize the rights of all peoples, including women who want to work underground in mines. But the most important one that allowed and facilitated the inclusion of women in mines in South Africa was what we call the Mining Charter. Now, the Mining Charter was not just saying that we need to have open space, but it was saying that we actually need to have a specific number of women as they start working underground. So they had quotas, they had targets, and it was a 10% target. So it was not just saying we open, but it was saying we need to do something and make sure we have real bodies that are underground, that are working underground. Not only did it have the targets, but it had time frames. So it was saying that within 5 years, we need to have about 10% of women working in this industry. So that really forced the mining industry not just to talk about inclusion, but to actually practice inclusion. But it was very clear on it's 10% for these next 5 years, and after 5 years we're going to review it. While we had all of these policies in place that allowed the inclusion of women in mines, and also we had targets that were set up by the government and that were taken very seriously by the mining industry, there continued to be challenges. And I'll get into the reason why we had these challenges. But one thing that I want to emphasize is that the inclusion of women in mining produced a state of something that I call a state of disorientation and ontological anxiety for a lot of men. So it was a real existential crisis for men that for a long time, they only had men underground, and all of a sudden they were going to have women underground. They had used the mines to justify the prowess of men, and all of a sudden that was being taken away from them. So there was a real existential crisis for men. But how did people respond then to these calls to include women in mining? And I talk about 3 responses. That some people were, and even when women started working in the mines, they continued to be very conservative and very reactionary. For them, they felt like, well, we cannot have women working in the mines because women belong in other spheres, not necessarily in spheres that have been described as masculine. They wanted then this group to maintain the status quo. They wanted, and they were using these ideas about biology, about physiology of women to legitimize their exclusion of women. So there was nothing, again, in essence, but it was these myths that for a long time were used to justify the exclusion of women from the mining spaces. So that was the very first group, the very reactive, very conservative one. And the second one, I call them the liberal feminist groups, but also the politicians in the country who were pushing, yes, we want to be inclusive. This symbolizes the breaking down of gender barriers in South Africa. It symbolizes advancement. It symbolizes all of these things that we say we are as the new South Africa. We're progressive. We're all about equality. So that was the second group. And the third group, when you talk about or think about them in relation to the inclusion of women in mining, they were much more critical. And they continued to be critical even when women started working underground. And for them, they were saying, well, yes, this symbolizes inclusion, but there's more that we need than just simple inclusion using quotas. For them, they were saying that what we need in South Africa and in mining is not just numbers of women working in these spaces, but what we actually need to do is to disrupt gender regimes. So it's not just inclusion, but it's to really unbundle the way in which people have been talking about masculinity, which has links to patriarchy, right? So they were saying, well, including women in mining then must make sure that it does not reinforce the gender order in any way. In fact, including women in mining, we must make sure that it disrupts these gender regimes, but it also disrupts the normativity of masculine bodies in mining spaces. So it disrupts the hegemony of men in mining spaces. But what they were saying was that research, though, shows that that doesn't always happen. What often happens when you're just including a few people in a space that has been defined in a particular way, in this case in masculine ways, what often happens is that you find people assimilating. So you're not changing the space, you're not changing the gender order, you're not changing gender regimes, but you have people assimilating. And so they were saying we need to think very carefully about the inclusion of women in mining. But this is not just about mining, and I think I'm using here mining as a case study, but when we're talking about inclusion, these are very similar conversations we're also having in the university about inclusion of black people in the very white institutions in South Africa. These are conversations we are having about including black professors, women professors in professions that have been, including the academy. So these were broader questions about inclusion, these were broader questions about patriarchy, these were broader questions about race, about gender, about class inclusion. So it was a very inclusive, and people were saying that, well, if you are just saying 10% of women in mines, what you're going to have then is this reinforcement of masculinity, and not really a complete changing of masculinity, of patriarchy, challenging that. So what exactly people often ask, so those are the three dominant narratives, and what I think I'm trying to show both in the book and what I will be showing in the next few minutes is that it's not just these three very separate dominant narratives. To understand what's actually happening in mining, you have to be much more nuanced than just having these blocks, right? And by being nuanced means seeing the relationship between what the liberal feminists are saying and what the critical perspective is saying. But people often ask me, but why would women want to work in the mines in the first place? Forget whether it's changing things on the ground. Why would women want to work in the mines? And in South Africa, the answer is very simple. One is unemployment. A conservative, and I want to emphasize this, a conservative unemployment figure in South Africa is 29% for women. This is conservative. By conservative, I mean there's other figures that are way higher than this. But the government, the way in which it calculates people's unemployment figures, the unemployment figure in the country rather, it says that we have an expanded definition and a narrow definition. So with expanded definition, it actually reflects what's happening on the ground. With the narrow definition, which is what I have here, it hides certain things around unemployment that are happening. Obviously, there's political questions around this, but let's leave it for now at 29%, that with high unemployment rate, you cannot be preventing people from taking up jobs in any industry. If there are jobs, everyone should be allowed, because high unemployment means poverty, it means a whole lot of other things, that decent work, decent life, decent wages that I was talking about. But also the second one was that in comparison to other industries like domestic work, which employs a whole lot of people in South Africa, industries like services industry, so the restaurant, mines were paying way more in relation, in comparison to, so I don't want people to think I'm saying mines are paying way more, because the reason we had Marikana is because mines are not paying enough when you consider the risks that workers take when they're going underground and the wealth that they produce by going underground. So in comparison to other industries, it was paying enough, it was paying more. And those are the figures that they are paid, but also the working conditions, while they are bad, they are terrible in comparison to other industries in a country that had apartheid for so long. The working conditions were relatively better. And by that, I'm making comparison to people who are working as security guards, who have to be out working, sometimes in bad weather conditions, out for 12 hours, right? So when you compare it like that, you see that, well, okay, it's not good conditions, but it's slightly better than other industries. But also the fact that the mining industry was offering people permanent employment. But while all of these things were happening, it was an attractive, quote-unquote, industry, and also there were laws allowing women to work underground. It remained an exclusionary industry. And what I mean by that is people were included in terms of the legislation, but when you look at their experiences underground, people continued to be excluded. What do I mean by then that they were included by excluded? And I'm going to keep using this term because we are unpacking inclusion. What do I mean by included but excluded in reality? From the moment women are hired in the mines, you get to see just how masculine the industry is. So from the tests that they do in order to be deemed fit to work underground, you see that actually there's no way that you can say you are including women in the industry if this test continues to be the way it has been for the past 50 years. So the tests and the screenings that were workers were being subjected to, you could see that there was exclusion, even though policy was saying women are allowed to work underground. But another one, it was about all these women who were being hired were hired in these low ranks. So you're hiring a lot of women, this 10% that you're obsessing about, but actually you're not giving women positions where they have power, where they can have power, where they can change things around. You're giving them the low ranks where they have absolutely no power. And if that's the case, how then can we call that inclusion? Hence, I continue to insist on they were included legislatively, but in practice, experientially, they were truly excluded. But also in reality, there were other occupations from which they were excluded. Now, I talked about the union at the beginning, and I was praising the union's workers for fighting for the rights of all workers, but I think we all know that unions are just as patriarchal as employers. In the case of the mining industry, the unions in the mines were obviously very masculine unions. It were unions that had had male members for a very long time, and so to have women joining them, while they were open to women joining them, they were not as welcoming to women. So again, that idea of included but excluded. But I think the biggest one for women, it was things like, well, you're saying we can work in the mines and we can go underground and be like all the other workers, but you've actually not even thought about maternity benefits. So that meant in South Africa, if a woman falls pregnant and she's working underground, the moment she finds out that she's pregnant, she had to stop going underground. But what does that mean? If you stop going underground and your male colleagues don't stop going underground because they don't fall pregnant, it means that you have to forgo your wages for 8 months. And I'm saying 8 months in a very conservative, because some women want to breastfeed. So if you're breastfeeding, that meant sometimes forgoing your wages, your salary for a year and a year and a half, depending on how long you... So these were things that continued to plague this whole inclusion debate in South Africa, that, well, then is it truly inclusion if we have not thought about the most basic things that affect women? But mostly, the biggest one was that mine culture continued to reflect the masculinity of the industry. Practices in the mines, the logics in the mines, the way work was organized, the way power was distributed, it continued to reflect this masculinity. So the mine culture continued to reflect men as the ones who are actually in charge and women as simply tokens that are being used to justify or to say that they've really included people or that they're transforming the industry. But in reality, because of the things I've already talked to, there was no real transformation. They continued to be included while excluded. But also the exclusion of women, it was not just in the culture, but also in the way things were done in the mining industry, right? So the moment you go to the training center, how training is conducted, all of these things, they reinforce the exclusion of women in mining. So you'll have people in one room being trained, let's say, to be winch operators, which was my occupation when I was working in the mines. You have 20 people being trained, but if there's a woman who's being trained alongside them, while they're using the same manual, the way in which the woman will be given the practical training will be slightly different from how the man will be given the practical training. And obviously, when people believe that you should not be in mining, when they want to exclude you from real and proper training, what they often say is that we are protecting you, we don't want you, you're a woman, you're fragile, we don't want you to do this kind of work. And if you don't want to do the work, you may end up not doing the work. But this protectionist discourse really, while it seemed like a progressive, it's guys who are being nice, it really also further entrenched the exclusion of women in mines, because it meant that while everybody else was being trained for particular occupations, these women were not getting proper training because men were busy protecting them underground. So there were lots of biases that were embedded in the ways in which even the training was carried out. So again, this idea of exclusion, but you are included, you are in the class, you're using the same manual, but really the way in which the training is conducted, it entrenches your exclusion. But other things, when you start working, you had teams. So when I was doing my research, I would work with different teams. Work with one team underground for about 2 months, move to another team for another 2 months, doing different occupations, whether we were digging, whether we were drilling, whether we were doing winch scraping, the ore, but working with different teams. But what I saw was that with women, instead, not all women, and in the book I go into the different ways in which different kinds of women are integrated or excluded. But with some women, there's what I thought was an isolation. So there was an exclusion, but that was manifesting as an isolation. So you're isolated from your team. We're supposed to work together as a team, and we're supposed to be doing A, B, C, D, and my job within this team is to drill. When men see that, oh, the job of this woman is to drill, they would exclude you, they would isolate you from the work itself and from the team and tell you to go do something else, whether it's to go and fetch water for them or paint direction lines underground and so forth. So a lot of women were isolated from their work and from their teams. But also they were alienated from the work. So people are doing the actual work of doing the underground work of mining, but women were often alienated from the work and told to do menial jobs that reproduced the domesticity of women. So not only were they being excluded while included, but also being treated like second-class citizens underground. But all of this, I want to emphasize again that none of this was blatant hostile. Right? So this protectionist discourse that we're protecting you, we don't want you to be in the stopes where it's very hot. As a result, we will put you far from the stove. But if you're putting me far from the stove, that means I'm not going to learn how to do the job, and it means I'm not ever going to be promoted. So in a way, while you're saying you're protecting me, you are further entrenching my marginalization. Right? And so there was a lot of that happening. But also, so there were those kind of, within the work itself, but also the biggest one that I also experienced was that of sexual harassment underground, right? That women underground were experiencing sexual harassment at all times. From the moment you enter the shaft, you go down the cage, you are underground. And by sexual harassment, I'm talking about remarks, the touching, the fondling, all sorts of things that were happening underground. And the mine was not ready to deal or to address this. So what you often had were men justifying why there is sexual harassment underground instead of putting in place measures that would protect and prevent women from experiencing sexual harassment. So you had mines saying that, well, sexual harassment is the culture of the mines. It's not really that they are harassing you, they are appreciating you. This is how things are. Very similar to the comments that Donald Trump was also making about women. Well, this is a locker room talk. This is what we're doing. So with women in mining also going through all of that, no, these men are appreciating you. They mean no harm, but harm was actually being done, and all women. So it's not just young women who are working underground in mines, it's also very old women. But for me, what was surprising was to hear old women, ages 40, 50, saying that I've experienced harassment, not just from the men I work with underground, but even managers above ground. Because we are isolated from our teams and we don't know the work sometimes, if I want a promotion, it often means I have to let the manager abuse me in one way or the other, or harass me in one way or the other. And they had something called carpet promotions, precisely because of the way in which work and power is organized in the mines in ways that look like they're protecting women, but actually putting women in the corner. But also what was interesting with sexual harassment then was that you had two things that were operating at the same time. You had the formal policies in place, but you also had the informal policies or discourses that were operating. The formal policies said that you could report sexual harassment, but in reality, you could not report sexual harassment. And even when you did report sexual harassment, nobody took it seriously because there were all these justifications that I talked about earlier. But what was all of this? So these were experiences basically of women in the mines, in platinum mines in particular. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's no real inclusion. What you see is people wanting women for tokenistic, just as tokens underground or in mining industry. You have people who think that policies and quotas are enough. They're not really thinking about creating an enabling environment that will allow women to work and to be recognized as equal partners underground, not as people who are being done a favor for underground. And I'm arguing here that if you really want to see inclusion in mining, we need to go beyond the quotas, we need to go beyond the policies, even though those are important. What we need to be thinking about is to decenter masculinity in the mines. And that's a difficult one because for a lot of mines, they think about productivity in the mines, they think about safety in the mines in relation to masculinity. So for you as a worker to do mine work, you have to do masculinity. So there's a connection between productivity and masculinity for the mines, and they mobilize masculinity to get workers productive. So when we're saying we need to de-link or decenter masculinity, a lot of mines resist that because they think that production is on the line, safety is on the line, even though that's not the case, and there's a lot of research that has shown that. But also what I'm saying in terms of these transformative possibilities is that we need to also de-gender or ungender certain occupations. So this idea that women cannot drill the rock or women cannot do particular occupations underground or even in mining generally, we need to undo that. So in other words, we need to target not just the industry as it is, but we need to be targeting the way in which masculinity is performed in these kind of spaces. We need to deal and create possibly new orders, new gender orders, yes, in the mines, but also broadly in society, and introduce new norms, because the norm is masculinity. The body that's the norm is a masculine body. But when we bring in new norms, by not just staying to the 10% that the government is proposing, but going beyond the 10% that the government is, that only then can you disrupt the way in which we think about masculinity and the mines and inclusion. So whether it's in the mines or it's in universities, whether we're talking about race, or we're talking about class, or we're talking about gender, when we're thinking about seriously about inclusion, quotas and policies don't do it, but we need to undo the very things that create structures that are oppressive to people. And I think I'll leave it at that. I didn't want to go into too much detail. I thought for a Friday, the theoretical stuff may not be the most relevant, but I have a couple of pictures that I want to show you to see, so that you see what life in mining is like. And I think South African mines are rather very different from other mines in the continent. And these were very reasons that women were excluded from mining at the beginning. They're highly mechanized, and I'll show you the pictures. So that's a picture of the mine shaft, what it looks like, and this is a picture of workers inside a cage. I talked about sexual harassment, that you experience sexual harassment from the moment you enter the shaft. So that means you experience sexual harassment over here because people are pushing to get inside the cage. And I have a lot of stories that in the chapters that I've been working on, where women detail stories of their harassment in these spaces, but especially inside the cage. Now the cage is the normal size of an elevator where you're supposed to have about 10, 12 people maximum. And in the mines, because of production again, and mines pushing it down, pushing it up rather, you have cages taking between 40 to 50 people going underground. So instead of 10 people, and so women in these spaces are really fondled. It's terrible. And there's more to it than just the fondling. And that's a team that I worked with underground. This is underground. This space now is underground. And that's a woman who's working underground, who's draining the water from the surface. This is one of the guys I worked with. He's barring down loose rocks. All of this is underground. I'm not sure if people can see from the back, but these are workers underground. And another woman that I worked with, I said that I started in 2008 doing this research. This is one of the women I worked with, and she was one of the few who was not just a general worker, who was a miner. And this is her, and yeah, that's me. Yep, because I was working. And that's drilling. So the Marikana story links up actually to this photo, because this is what drilling underground looks like. And the workers who were protesting, demanding a decent wage, these are the workers. These are the people who sit like this for 8 hours and are paid very menial wages. And it's not just sitting like this for 8 hours, but it's also the noise. What I often do in my class when I do the lectures on Marikana is I also play the videos. And it's so noisy underground. Imagine being close to a speaker that's on 1,000 decibels. I think that's what it's called. 1,000 decibels, sitting in that room for 8 hours, doing hard labor under these conditions. And then you tell me that demanding 12,500 rands is asking for too much. When you actually consider the conditions, it's definitely not asking for too much. And this is also another picture. This is what it looks like. This is me and some of my colleagues, again, the work that we were doing, and these are women who are working in mines. And one other thing that I didn't mention at the beginning, and that's the last slide, I didn't mention at the beginning, is that there are about 11% women now working in the mines. But because of the obsession with the quotas, people think that 11% is enough. And what I'm arguing for here, and in the paper that I've written, that I'm developing also for the book chapter, is that we need to go beyond the 10% if we're really talking inclusion. The 10% is just entry, is just incorporation, but we need to do more if we want to see changes in the industry and if we want to truly include women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asanda. Really. You know, one thing I like about what you are doing and what you did is the participant observer dimension. I am an academic. I want to intellectually know this particular area of human activity. I'm not going to confine myself to reading articles, reading stories, seeing films or videos. I am actually going to do the thing myself. That's extremely important. Mining, absolutely tasking. But although I am an academic and I want to further understand this area, I am going to be a miner, not for one day, but for a month. That's a very important, daring, and brave approach which you took, which I submit my US students to, because right now they are big participant observers in many villages, you know, being maybe eaten away by mosquitoes, but still, and nevertheless, if they want to understand, they've got to go in those villages. The pedagogical quality of your presentation. Anybody, even if they are not from the academic world, as long as they understand a little bit of English, they will very easily understand what you have been explaining. We have never been into mines, but we certainly understand what you've been trying to make us understand. I would say, your objective and unbiased approach. We are not talking about a feminist academic. We are simply talking about an academic casting an objective and critical eye on a situation which need to be better understood so as to be improved. And the active vocabulary you had in relation to the unequal, unfair relation between the two genders in all walks of life, which is grounded on a tenet which is universal, the domesticity of women. Because all representations of human communities are based on masculinity made possible by the domesticity of women. we need to deconstruct all this in order to have a better, a fairer, a more balanced, relationship between the various components of human societies. Basically, this is what we can learn from your presentation. As far as I'm concerned, I think I am going to ask humbly for your contribution again. I ask Mbacho, whom you know, to go to the university and give me maybe my schedule, the classes I will be teaching for the next 3 months. But if you agree, because look at this classroom, or look at this lecture room, how many women do you see here? Yeah, and in the Department of English, not only there are women faculty branding themselves, saying that they have a feminist slant, but also the thing I have been rehashing with my students at the university, the first thing I do is look at them all and tell them, these are the presentations you would like please to make as part of a class. And my first reaction is to encourage the young women who are in the classroom, to raise their fingers and take at least one presentation. They all know, because they all are in my classes, and they know the hard time I'm having getting some of them to volunteer. I would have liked to see them here, but not seeing them here, maybe before you go, it doesn't have to be on the particular books which are assigned, but a perspective on, this need to have, even a mild one, a feminist approach. The question is simple. We are poorly represented in the world. We've been misrepresented. Let's set the picture right. And there are some of the categories you use here, they are not simply applicable to my need. They are applicable to wherever you need women to be aware of their situation, and where you have the need for women not only to be aware of their situation, but also to be aware of a need, even mildly, to fight for things to be redressed. So thank you very much for this presentation, and we'll talk about the dimension maybe today is Friday, maybe Monday or Tuesday, and I'll have my schedule from the university and we'll discuss it. So maybe if you allow.
We were just talking about now, the way in which our society is organized. I don't think it's a matter of advertising differently, though that may help. But I think and what I mean by the way our society is organized, so in the trade union movement in South Africa after 1994 again, people kept asking, but why are women not coming to the meetings, right? Why are women not doing A, B, C, D? And a research was conducted, and this is just for this one group, but I think it's a lot of this findings have been coming up, similar findings have been coming up in different environments, and women were like, well, when we finish work, first of all, union meetings are in the afternoon. The moment we finish work as women, that domesticity is real. We have to go home and cook. We have to go pick up the kids, because again, for me, it takes us back to patriarchy, where men are not expected to do certain jobs and women are expected to do them, where the domestic sphere and the raising of children is sort of seen as women's work and not men's work. And so women are constantly having to juggle so many other things other than a semina, right? Because in the home space, nothing has changed. In the home space, they are still expected to carry a heavy load, the invisible work that I talk about in the article you were referring to. The work that we don't often recognize as work, but it's actually work because it takes so much time, and it often takes women away from public spaces such as this one. So I totally understand why I would not see women here, but I think it's a reflection of society. It's a reflection of how our work is structured. So we talk about gender division of labor. I think for me it's a reflection of how that gender division of labor is still deeply entrenched in ways that give women what we call the second shift, or the multiple shifts actually, not just the second shift, that they have to do that men don't have to do, so they have the luxury of attending and doing things that would enrich their lives, whereas women have to go home and cook, have to go home and take care of their kids. So for me, it talks to that, and how do we change it? I don't necessarily, I mean, I think it would help to advertise, but I think WAC does a great job of advertising. I've seen it on Facebook, I've seen it. But I think it goes to what Sylvia Federici, a feminist, socialist feminist, talks to as a revolution at point zero. Point zero being, so we talk about revolution in public spaces. So when you see people in public spaces revolting, that's a revolution. But she's talking about a revolution at point zero, and point zero being the household. That for us to see changes in broader society, there has to be a revolution, not just in Tahrir Square in Egypt, but a revolution in the home where men are taking up some of the responsibilities that are so heavy on women, that take women away from these public spaces. So I think for me, really, it would be, we need to again go back to that ungendering, de-gendering, confronting patriarchy in order to address some of these things. It's not just women not pitching, but it's what are women doing that prevents them from coming to these spaces. So that would be my, my response. I don't know if that makes any sense, but similar studies have been done in the academy where women academics are not as successful as male academics, and you ask what's happening. And they say, well, the moment I have a child, I have a husband who's not as supportive, even though he professes to be a feminist. The moment I have a child as a female academic, I can't do the work that I was able to do before having children. I have to now juggle publishing with raising children, and that's something that men often don't do. Men don't juggle things, so they continue, even when they've had children, to work as if they've not had children, instead to outsource the labor that women often do in the household. So that would be my response.